Welcome back to where we peel back the ordinary to reveal the chilling truths that lie beneath. The stories we explore here are not for the faint of heart. They are deep dives into the shadows of the human psyche. Before we proceed, if you are dedicated to uncovering these hidden narratives and confronting the darker aspects of our world, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and activate notifications. It's the best way to ensure you never miss an investigation into the unknown. Today's story begins with a simple, almost mundane event: the clearing out of a deceased person's home. But within the dusty relics of a life lived in quiet obscurity, a discovery was made. A discovery that would unlock the secrets of a city's most brutal and baffling cold cases. This is the story of the day the police found a diary, and in doing so, found the voice of a monster who had walked among them, unseen, for decades. Detective Miles Corbin existed in a world of ghosts. They weren't the spectral, chain-rattling kind, but the ghosts of unanswered questions, of files stamped cold case in faded red ink, of victims whose faces stared out from black and white photos on his corkboard. At 58, with a face that seemed carved from granite and eroded by 1,000 weary sighs, Corbin was an anachronism in the gleaming, modern headquarters of the Viridia Police Department. His office was a small, cluttered cave filled with the scent of stale coffee, old paper, and the faint metallic tang of regret. His partner, Detective Isabella Rossi, was his polar opposite. Sharp, tech-savvy, and 30 years his junior, she navigated the digital world of law enforcement with an intuitive grace that left Corbin feeling like a relic. Yet, she possessed a deep respect for his old-school tenacity, for the way he could see patterns in the chaos that software algorithms often missed. Theirs was a partnership built on a bridge between two different eras of crime-solving. The call that would change everything came on a Tuesday afternoon, a day so unremarkable that its memory would later seem like a cruel joke. It wasn't a homicide or a robbery in progress. It was a call from a patrol unit dispatched to an estate sale in the city's older, quieter suburbs, a neighborhood of post-war bungalows and overgrown gardens. An elderly woman, a Mrs. Gable, had reportedly become hysterical after purchasing a box of old books and journals. Probably just found some old love letters and got the vapors, Rossi commented, scrolling through her tablet as they drove. You sure this is worth both of us, Miles? Everything's worth a look, Rossi, Corbin grumbled, his eyes fixed on the rain-slicked streets. Complacency is the killer's best friend. They arrived at a modest, beige house, its contents spilling out onto the front lawn under a series of pop-up tents. It was old, the dark green leather cracked with age, its pages filled with a precise, almost unervingly neat cursive. It was a diary. The name on the inside cover read Arthur Penwright. What's in it that's got you so spooked, ma'am? Corbin asked, his voice gentle. Page 12, she whispered. He talks about the girl from the park, the one they called the Sparrow. Corbin felt a cold jolt, a phantom sensation he hadn't felt in years. The Sparrow was Julia Ames, a 20-year-old college student, murdered in Oak Hill Park 25 years ago. It was one of Corbin's first cases as a homicide detective, a case that had gone cold with brutal speed, leaving behind nothing but a victim, a grieving family, and a file thick with dead ends. Corbin and Rossi took the diary back to the station. In the sterile quiet of an interrogation room, they opened it. The ink was faded, but the words were terrifyingly clear. Arthur Penwright had a voice that was both erudite and utterly devoid of empathy. It was the voice of a predator who saw the world as his personal hunting ground. Corbin began to read the entry for October 14, 1998, aloud. October 14, 1998. The autumn has a particular quality this year, a crispness that seems to clarify the world. It sharpens the senses. I have been observing a specimen for 11 days. A young woman, a student. She has a routine as all creatures of habit do. She studies in the park on the same bench every afternoon. She has a habit of feeding the sparrows, which I find charmingly naive. A misplaced sense of kinship with a lesser creature. It is this predictability, this trust in the world, that makes her the perfect subject. Tonight, the conditions were optimal. The park was nearly empty, the air cold enough to deter the usual loiterers. She was packing her books, her movements precise, unaware. The approach must be silent, a whisper in the world's great noise. I have found that a simple question, "Excuse me, do you have the time?" is the most effective key. It bypasses their social defenses. They look down at their watch, a moment of vulnerability. A moment is all that is required. The process itself was educational. The human body is a machine, a complex timepiece of sinew and bone. But like any machine, it can be disassembled. I was particularly interested in the transition, the moment the light of consciousness is extinguished. It is not a flicker, as the poets would have you believe. It is more of a slow dimming, a surrender. I left her beneath the old oak tree, positioned as if she were sleeping. A final act of aesthetic consideration. The police will be clumsy. They will look for passion, for rage. They will not understand the cold, clean logic of the artist, the scientist. They will call her the Sparrow, a fitting, if sentimental, name. She has, after all, taken flight. Corbin's voice faltered. He looked up at Rossi, whose face was pale. Every detail matched the cold case file. The location, the method of approach he'd long suspected but could never prove, the almost poetic arrangement of the body details that had never been released to the public. This wasn't a prank. It wasn't a work of fiction. It was a confession. They spent the next several hours in a state of feverish disbelief. Who was Arthur Penwright? A preliminary search revealed he was a recently deceased 82-year-old man. He had lived his entire life in the beige bungalow where the sale was being held. He had worked for 45 years as a librarian at the city's central library. He had never married, had no children, and his neighbors described him as quiet, reclusive, and harmless. The man who had haunted Corbin's nightmares for a quarter of a century was an invisible, unassuming librarian. As they turned the brittle pages, a horrifying realization began to dawn on them. Julia Ames was not the only one. The diary was a meticulously kept ledger of murder, spanning nearly 50 years. They read about the businessman, a man found in a downtown alley in 2005, a case written off as a robbery gone wrong. The diary described how Penwright had stalked him for weeks, fascinated by his arrogance, his ticking clock of self-importance, and how he had dismantled his life with the same dispassionate curiosity he'd shown for the Sparrow. They read about the Drifter, a homeless man whose disappearance in 1982 was never even investigated. Penwright had seen him as a broken watch, a piece of humanity that society had discarded, and in his twisted logic, he believed his actions were a form of mercy, of stopping the hands of a timepiece that no longer served a purpose. Each entry was a chilling blend of philosophical musing, precise operational detail, and a terrifying, godlike arrogance. He gave his victims archetypal names, reducing them to specimens in his long, private study of death. He detailed how he'd followed the police investigations in the papers, critiquing their methods with the detached air of a master craftsman watching an amateur fumble with his tools. The diary wasn't just a confession. It was a secret history of the city's darkness. It connected cases that detectives had, for decades, believed to be unrelated. The MO was always different, the victimology varied. The only through line was the killer's invisibility and the chillingly detailed account recorded in the neat, elegant cursive on the page. Corbin felt the weight of 30 years of failure settle upon him. All these ghosts, all these victims. He had looked for a monster, a slavering beast. But the killer had been a quiet man who stamped books and recommended novels. He had been hiding in plain sight, protected by the cloak of his own mundanity. As the night deepened outside, Rossi turned a page and her breath hitched. "Miles, look at this." The entry was dated just 6 months prior. It was shorter than the others, the handwriting slightly less steady, hinting at Penwright's advancing age and failing health. January 12, 2023. The mechanism is beginning to fail. The hands of my own clock grow heavy. There is a tremor in my fingers that offends my sense of precision. But there is time for one last study. A final masterpiece. She is a musician, a cellist. The music she creates is sublime, But there is a flaw in her rhythm, a sadness in her composition. She is an instrument out of tune. I have found the perfect workshop for my final piece of work. A place of silence and solitude where the final note can be played without interruption. The process will be my swan song. A final, perfect silence. The diary ended there. The following pages were blank. A cellist? Rossi whispered, her fingers flying across her keyboard, searching the missing persons database. He was planning another one, just before he died. Corbin stared at the final, chilling words. The monster was dead, but his work, his final masterpiece, remained a mystery. Had he been too ill to carry it out? Or had he succeeded one last time, leaving behind a ghost that no one, until this moment, even knew was missing? The diary had answered so many questions, but it had just given them one more, and it was the most terrifying one of all. The discovery of Arthur Penright's diary sent a seismic shock through the Viridia Police Department. The cold, quiet halls of the Homicide Division, usually buzzing with the steady hum of active cases, were now consumed by a frantic, almost obsessive energy directed at the past. The leather-bound journal, now handled with forensic gloves and treated as a sacred text from hell, became the focal point of the largest cold case review in the city's history. For Detective Miles Corbin, sleep became a luxury he could no longer afford. He lived in a state of suspended animation between the present and the past, fueled by caffeine and a gnawing, visceral guilt. He had Penright's voice in his head, the killer's calm, erudite prose narrating the city's secret history of violence. He saw the world through the diarist's Aisa collection of specimens and timepieces, their routines and vulnerabilities laid bare. The city he had sworn to protect felt like a charade, its peaceful surface masking the decades-long hunting expedition of a single, invisible man. The primary task was verification. Under the command of a stunned but resolute police chief, teams of detectives were assembled. Their mission, to cross-reference every entry in Penright's 50-year ledger of death with every unsolved murder and long-term missing persons case in the city's archives. It was a Herculean task. The archives were a catacomb of decaying paper, the files brittle with age and filled with the ghosts of failed investigations. Corbin and Rossi led the effort, becoming the chief interpreters of the killer's mind. While other detectives sifted through evidence boxes and microfiche, they delved deeper into the diary itself, building a psychological portrait of the man who had been a ghost. Arthur Penright, they learned, was a man of profound, almost pathological order. His life was a monument to routine. He left for his job at the library at 7:45 a.m. every morning and returned at 5:15 p.m. every evening. His neighbors confirmed he was rarely seen after dark. His library colleagues described him as meticulous, erudite, and intensely private. He was an expert in historical texts and book restoration, a man whose hands were dedicated to preserving stories, even as they were secretly authoring the city's most gruesome ones. He was a paradox, a preserver and a destroyer. The diary entries provided the terrifying bridge between his two lives. They were written with a chilling detachment, as if Penright were a biologist documenting the behavior of a lesser species. Entry from June 4, 1976. Subject: The Salesman. A creature of manufactured charisma and false promises. His life is a performance, a series of hollow gestures designed to build a trust he immediately betrays for profit. I have watched him for 3 weeks. He preys on the lonely, the elderly, selling them worthless investment schemes. He is a flaw in the social mechanism, a gear that grinds against the others. Society lacks the tools for such precise repairs. I, however, do not. The chosen location was the parking garage beneath his office building. He felt powerful there, his footsteps echoing in the concrete emptiness. I used his own tool against him, a false promise. A note on his windshield about a supposed scratch on his car. He approached, his face a mask of indignation. His guard was down. The human mind is so easily diverted by appeals to vanity and property. The subsequent procedure was corrective. I relieved him of the tools of his trade, his expensive watch, his gaudy rings, his wallet full of other people's money. The police will see it as a simple robbery. They are trained to see the motive, not the purpose. They will never understand that the goal was not acquisition, but removal. This entry, cross-referenced with the unsolved murder of a financial consultant named Marcus Thorne, was a perfect match. The police at the time had focused on disgruntled clients, never once considering the possibility of a killer motivated by a twisted sense of cosmic justice. Penwright was a moral philosopher with a knife, a self-appointed surgeon cutting what he perceived as cancers from the body of society. As they delved deeper, they saw his methodology evolve. In his early years, his crimes were simpler, more opportunistic. As he grew older and more confident, they became elaborate, meticulously planned projects. He would research his victims for months, learning their habits, their fears, their secret shames. He was a master of exploiting the quiet desperation of the human condition. Entry from March 22, 1991. Subject: the housewife. She lives in a gilded cage on Crestview Drive. Her life is a monument to silent despair. Her husband is neglectful. Her children are grown and distant. She fills her days with meaningless errands, her smile a carefully maintained facade. She is a beautiful, ornate clock that has simply stopped telling time. I began a correspondence, posing as a secret admirer, a poet who had seen the true soul beneath her suburban disguise. I sent her letters, poems. I awoke the part of her that had been dormant for decades. Our first and only meeting was arranged for the Botanical Gardens. She was nervous, hopeful. She confessed her loneliness, the emptiness of her life. She was so grateful to be seen. In this state of heightened emotional vulnerability, she was pliable. She willingly accompanied me to a more secluded location. Her end was not violent. It was a release. I believe, in her final moments, she was happier than she had been in 20 years. Her disappearance will be a mystery. Her husband will assume she ran away with a lover. He will be right in a sense. She did. She ran away from a life of quiet agony. I was merely the final door she walked through. This entry solved the 28-year-old mystery of Eleanor Vance, a wealthy socialite who had vanished without a trace, leaving behind her car and her purse. Her case had become a local legend, a cautionary tale of suburban ennui. The truth, as Penwright described it, was infinitely more sinister. Corbin found himself becoming consumed by the killer's mindset. He started to see the city as Penwright did, noticing the predictable patterns of people's lives, their small vulnerabilities. He would sit in his car on a stakeout and profile strangers, imagining how Penwright would have seen them, how he would have cataloged their flaws. Rossi noticed the change. The case was giving him answers, but it was also hollowing him out, replacing parts of him with the chilling logic of the man he was hunting posthumously. "Miles, you need to go home," she insisted one night. As he sat under the fluorescent lights of the incident room, the diary opened before him like a Bible. "You haven't slept in 2 days. This man is dead. He can't hurt anyone else." "He's not dead in here," Corbin replied, tapping his temple. "He's still talking. And we still haven't found his last victim." The mystery of the cellist from the final entry had become Corbin's singular obsession. They had cross-referenced every missing persons report for musicians in the last year. Nothing. They'd canvassed local orchestras, music schools, and performance venues. No one knew of a cellist who had simply vanished. It was as if Penwright's final victim didn't exist. The team investigating Penwright's life had hit similar walls. He was a ghost. He had no living relatives. He paid his bills on time. He had no digital footprint. His house was a time capsule, filled with thousands of books, classical music records, and dozens of antique clocks, all meticulously maintained. In his basement, they found a small, soundproofed workshop. It was immaculately clean, but forensic analysis revealed microscopic, decades-old traces of blood from multiple unidentified sources. It was his laboratory. It was Rossi who made the breakthrough. She wasn't focusing on the victim. She was focusing on Penwright's language. He wrote, "I have found the perfect workshop for my final piece of work," she said, pointing to the diary. "He doesn't say he's going to use his own workshop. He says he's found one. a place of silence and solitude. Her mind began to race through the case files. Penwright was a librarian. He had access to city records, property deeds, architectural plans. He knew the city's hidden spaces better than anyone. Miles, she said, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. His final victim wasn't a person. Not just a person. His final masterpiece. It was the murder itself. He needed a stage. A place no one would ever think to look. Corbin looked at the final entry again. A place of silence and solitude, where the final note can be played without interruption. The words hung in the air, thick with menace. The monster was dead, but he had left them one final, horrifying puzzle box. And somewhere in the city, Corbin knew. A victim's story was waiting, in total silence, to be heard. They weren't just looking for a body anymore. They were looking for a tomb. The search for Arthur Penwright's final workshop transformed the investigation. They were no longer just sifting through the past. They were in a desperate race against the fading echo of a dead man's thoughts. The words "a place of silence and solitude" became their mantra. A cryptic clue left behind by a meticulous, malevolent ghost. Detective Corbin, driven by an obsession that bordered on the self-destructive, began to live inside Penwright's mind. He spent his days at the city archives, poring over the same property records and architectural blueprints that Penwright, in his capacity as the head historical librarian, would have had access to for decades. He was looking for anomalies, forgotten buildings, abandoned subway tunnels, decommissioned municipal properties, places that had fallen through the cracks of the city's memory, places that were officially empty, silent. Rossi, meanwhile, took a different approach. She focused on the victim, the cellist. If she wasn't in any missing persons database, it meant her absence hadn't been reported. Why? Was she a recluse? An immigrant with no family in the country? A student who was known to travel? Rossi's team began the painstaking work of building a profile of a ghost, contacting music conservatories and freelance orchestra contractors across the state, asking about any female cellists who had dropped off the radar around January of that year. Weeks turned into a month. The initial frantic energy of the investigation began to wane, replaced by a grim, grinding procedural slog. The media had caught wind of the story, and the librarian killer was now the city's ghoulish celebrity. The pressure on the department was immense, but Penwright's secrets were well kept. The breakthrough came from Corbin. Late one night, surrounded by dusty blueprints, he found it. It was a plan for the old city courthouse, a grand, Gothic structure that had been abandoned in the 1980s when the new Justice Center was built. It was a landmark, a place everyone knew, but no one ever went into. According to the plans, the building had a series of subbasements, including a large, soundproofed evidence vault that was decommissioned even before the courthouse itself was closed. It was listed on the plans simply as Sublevel C, Archival Storage, a place of perfect silence, hidden in plain sight. Corbin felt a surge of adrenaline that cut through his exhaustion. He knew, with an instinct that transcended evidence, that this was the place. The next morning, a full forensic team, led by Corbin and Rossi, converged on the abandoned courthouse. The air inside was thick with the dust of decades, and the silence was absolute. They descended flight after flight of concrete stairs, their flashlights cutting sharp beams through the oppressive darkness. The door to Sublevel C was a massive slab of steel, its lock long since seized with rust. It took a battering ram and 2 officers to force it open. The room beyond was just as the blueprints described, a large concrete vault. But it wasn't empty. In the center of the room sat a single, elegant wooden chair, and in the chair sat the skeletal remains of a woman. She was slumped forward, her skull resting on the beautifully carved wood of a cello, which she still held in a skeletal embrace. The scene was one of serene, calculated horror. It was Penwright's masterpiece, a private concert for an audience of one, frozen in time. Around the room, forensics teams found subtle, horrifying touches. On a small, dusty table lay a single, preserved sheet of Music Bach's Cello Suite No. 1. There were also remnants of food and water, suggesting the victim had been kept alive here for some time. This wasn't just a murder. It was a prolonged, psychological torture. Rossi, her face grim, knelt near the victim. Tucked into a pocket of the woman's decayed coat was a wallet. The ID inside was faded but legible. Her name was Anya Sharma. A quick search on Rossi's tablet confirmed her tragic story. She was a foreign exchange student from India, a prodigy at the Viridia Music Conservatory. She had no family in the United States. When she stopped showing up for classes, the school assumed she had simply returned home without notice, a not uncommon occurrence. Her disappearance had never once been reported to the police. She had vanished from the world as silently as a final, fading musical note. The discovery provided a somber, gut-wrenching closure. The case of the librarian killer was finally truly over. Every victim had been identified, every secret confession brought into the light. The city held a memorial for the dozens of victims, their names now linked in a shared, tragic history. For Detective Miles Corbin, the end of the case was not a victory. It was an exorcism. He had solved the cases that had defined and haunted his entire career, but the cost was a piece of his own soul. He had looked into the mind of Arthur Penwright, and the darkness he found there had left an indelible shadow on him. He could no longer look at a quiet neighbor, a reserved coworker, or a stranger on a bus without a flicker of suspicion, without wondering what secrets, what meticulously kept ledgers, lay behind their ordinary eyes. A few weeks after the discovery, Corbin put in his retirement papers. His work was done. He had given the ghosts their names back, and that would have to be enough. On his last day, Rossi found him in his now barren office, packing the last of his belongings into a cardboard box. The corkboard on the wall, once a tapestry of dead ends and unanswered questions, was completely empty. "You know," Rossi said, leaning against the doorframe, "for what it's worth, Miles, no one else could have done this. No one else would have kept looking. You gave them justice." Corbin paused, holding an old, framed photo of his graduating class from the police academy. He looked so young, so full of a certainty the world had long since beaten out of him. "We didn't give him justice, Rossi," he said, his voice heavy. "He died warm in his bed, full of secrets. We just read the footnotes he left behind. The real justice was for them." He gestured to the empty corkboard. "We made sure they weren't forgotten. That's the job, to make sure no one is forgotten." He placed the photo in the box and taped it shut. As he walked out of his office for the last time, he didn't look back. The ghosts were finally quiet, but the diary, locked away deep in an evidence vault, remained silent, leather-bound testament to the terrifying truth that the most monstrous stories are often written in the quietest rooms, by the most ordinary of hands.